Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to untangle a really common but honestly absolutely critical point of confusion in modern system architecture. We are talking about API keys versus access tokens. Now, if you've ever built an app that needs to call an API, you've definitely had to provide one of these. And let's be real, they look completely identical, but as we're going to see today, they do entirely different jobs. Let's jump right in.
So this brings up a really simple question. Are they just the same thing? Because both of these credentials are these incredibly long, totally random-looking strings of text that you send off with HTTP requests to platforms like Google, AWS, or Stripe, it's so tempting to wonder if you can just swap one out for the other. I mean, why do so many major platforms actually force you to use both?
Well, visually, they absolutely look like twins. They're just strings of text. But treating them as interchangeable, that is a massive architectural mistake. It's a fundamental misunderstanding that leads to highly insecure system design, mostly because they are actually solving two vastly different security problems.
So here's the crucial takeaway, really the golden rule for this entire explainer. It all comes down to identity versus authority. An API key is there to identify an application. An access token, on the other hand, is there to authorize a user or manage delegated access. If you just keep that distinction in your head, everything else we covered today is going to lock perfectly into place.
Here is our architectural blueprint for today. 1. The Great API Confusion. 2. API Keys, Application Identity. 3. Access Tokens, User Authorization. 4. Verification and Lifetimes. 5. The Attacker's Perspective. 6. Layering Security Architectures.
Section 1. API Keys, Application Identity.
Let's isolate the API key first and see exactly how it functions on its own. Imagine you're building a weather application. To get the data, your app needs to call a cloud provider, and their documentation asks for an API key. The best way to think about this key is like a company's employee ID card. It identifies the software organization making the request. It does not identify the human sitting at the keyboard checking the weather. It purely proves that the request came from your registered application. And because they represent the application itself, modern API gateways use these cryptographically random keys mostly for machine-to-machine integrations. The backend associates that API key with things like your rate limits, your billing accounts, usage quotas, and service plans. It's all about traffic management and tracking which developer account to bill. It is completely devoid of any individual user authentication.
Section 2. Access Tokens, User Authorization. Now, let's pivot and look at a vastly different role and why it fundamentally changes the nature of an API request. Let's say you're building a web application where users sign in with a service like Google OAuth. After a successful login, the authorization server issues an access token. Unlike our weather app example, this token represents a living, breathing, authenticated human being. It tells the system that a specific person logged in and granted their permission to this application. When your app sends this token over in an authorization header, the API learns an incredible amount of context. It suddenly knows exactly who the authenticated user is, what specific permissions they have, the granted scopes of access, and exactly when that token expires. This token proves authority and delegated access on behalf of a user, rather than just identifying the piece of software making the call.
Section 3. Verification and Lifetimes.
Let's peel back the curtain a bit here. We know what these credentials represent conceptually, but how does the backend actually process them? Well, when an API gateway receives an API key, there's no inherent cryptographic verification built into a standard random string. The backend typically has to perform a secure database lookup. It has to verify the key exists, check that it's still active, calculate its current usage against its quotas and limits, and only then decide whether to accept or reject the request.
Now, what's really interesting is how differently access tokens are verified. Engineers face a classic trade-off here. Tokens can be self-contained, usually formatted as JWTs, meaning the API can verify the digital signature locally without ever needing to hit a database. Or they can be opaque tokens, which are just random references that have to be checked against an introspection endpoint. JWTs scale way better by reducing server calls, while opaque tokens give you stronger centralized control for things like immediate revocation.
Comparing their life cycles side by side reveals a ton. Just look at the typical lifetimes. API keys are long-lived secrets, often lasting for months or even years unless somebody manually rotates them. Access tokens, however, are intentionally short-lived. We're talking expiring in minutes or hours, and that short expiration,
That's a deliberate security design to limit the window of damage if a token ever gets stolen.
Section 4. The attacker's perspective. Speaking of stolen tokens, let's flip our perspective entirely. Imagine you are an attacker on the hunt for these credentials. How are you going to exploit the differences between an API key and an access token? Well, attackers know that the underlying cryptographic protocols, things like TLS or digital signatures, are rarely the weakest link. Instead, they target poor credential management. They scrape public GitHub repos for accidentally committed API keys. They use cross-site scripting, malware, or memory scraping to pull access tokens right out of insecure client-side storage or compromised browsers. The impact of these thefts really highlights their architectural differences. If an attacker finds an API key hard-coded in front-end JavaScript, which happens way more often than you'd think, they can impersonate the application and bypass rate limits for months. But if they steal an access token, their window to impersonate that specific user is rapidly closing, often completely shutting them out in less than an hour when the token naturally expires.
Section 5. Layering security architectures.
To conclude our analysis, let's synthesize all of this. We've looked at them in isolation, but how do modern, large-scale enterprise systems actually apply defense in depth in the real world? The truth is, large production systems don't choose between the two. They combine them. A highly secure API request will often contain both credentials simultaneously. The backend application authenticates itself to the API gateway using an API key, while the user's specific action is authorized via an OAuth access token. This brilliantly layers application identity and user authorization into one incredibly secure transaction.
Which leaves us with this final thought. You literally cannot easily forge a signed access token, and you certainly aren't going to guess a cryptographically secure API key. The math just works. But as we've seen today, attackers don't attack the math. They attack exposed secrets, weak storage, and poor key rotation. So the ultimate question you have to ask yourself isn't whether your keys are complex enough, but rather, are your operational practices secure enough to protect your system from leaked secrets?